50 years ago, a young woman in the hills of eastern Pennsylvania walked out of her school after a long Thursday afternoon and was never seen alive again. She left behind a classroom full of 8-year-olds who came back the next morning to find a substitute teacher and an empty candy jar on the desk where she always sat. She left behind a mother who spent the next 35 years waiting for an answer that never came. And she left behind, without knowing it, a single piece of evidence so small it fit inside a paper envelope. An evidence envelope that sat in a deteriorating archive box for half a century, waiting for a technology that didn't exist yet. The woman was Carol Ann Weathers. She was 24 years old. She was a third-grade teacher in the coal region town of Harwick Falls, Pennsylvania. And in January of 1976, she disappeared from the parking lot of the school, where she'd taught for 2 years, without a witness, without a clear motive, and without a suspect anyone in her community believed capable of what had been done to her. Police at the time believed she had left voluntarily. The case faded. The town moved on, the way towns do, or tried to. Then, 50 years later, a detective in the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit pulled an old evidence kit off a shelf, found the envelope, and sent it to a lab. What came back changed everything, and the name that came back with it, the name that finally answered the question, was one that nearly everyone in Harwick Falls had trusted without question for 50 years. To understand what that meant, you have to go back to January of 1976. You have to understand what kind of town Harwick Falls was. And you have to understand who Carol Ann Weathers was before any of this happened to her. 1976 was the bicentennial year, and even in the hills of eastern Pennsylvania, where January meant coal smoke hanging low over the ridgelines and ice on the creek roads before dawn, the holiday spirit had not fully left. The hardware store on Harwick Falls Main Street had already put up red and white bunting along the awning. The Borough Council was planning a 4th of July celebration that people were already calling the biggest the town had ever done. Harwick Falls was a place that believed in itself. It had been a coal town since the 1880s, and when the last underground mine had closed in 1961, it had regrouped the way it always had. Quietly, without complaint. The way people do when they've spent 4 generations learning that the ground beneath you is not always reliable. By 1976, the town had about 6,100 people. 3 churches, a diner on the corner of Main and Spruce, where the men who worked the early shift at the paper mill came in at 5:30 in the morning before the sun was up. A volunteer fire department that had been operating since 1923, and a school district that was the pride of the county. You knew your neighbors. You knew their parents. When someone was sick, a casserole appeared at the door without anyone having to ask. Carol Ann Weathers had grown up 3 blocks from the school where she taught. Her mother, Evelyn, still lived in the house where Carol had been raised, a narrow 2-story on Birch Street, with a green door and a porch where Evelyn grew tomatoes in the summer in pots she'd had since before Carol was born. Carol's father had died when she was 11, and it had been the 2 of them since then, and her older brother Thomas, who had moved to Allentown after college but called every Sunday and came home for holidays and never missed his mother's birthday. Carol had wanted to be a teacher since she was 7 years old. She had gone to Kutztown State College on a partial scholarship, graduated in 1973, and come back to Harwick Falls to take the 3rd-grade position that had opened up at Wheatley Elementary, because it was what she had always pictured herself doing, in the place she had always pictured herself doing it. She was patient in the particular way that good elementary teachers are, unhurried, genuinely curious about children, able to sit with a struggling student for 45 minutes after the dismissal bell without looking at the clock. She kept a glass jar of root beer barrel candies on the corner of her desk, the old-fashioned kind that came wrapped in cellophane, and she refilled it every Monday morning. The children knew the jar. They talked about it. Years later, some of them would say that what they remembered first, when they remembered Carol Weathers, was the smell of those candies and the sound of a cellophane wrapper. She had a best friend from high school named Diane Kozlowski, who worked at the county assessor's office and met her for lunch on Wednesdays. She had her Sunday phone calls with her mother, which lasted anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour depending on what Evelyn had seen that week in the neighborhood. She had a small apartment in the rented half of a duplex on Maple Avenue, 3 blocks from the school, and she had furnished it herself over 2 years with pieces she found at estate sales and a daybed she'd reupholstered herself using instructions from a library book because she'd wanted it in a specific blue and couldn't find it in any store. She was planning a trip to see Thomas in Allentown in February. She was going to take the bus. She had circled the departure times in the Trailways schedule she kept on her refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a covered bridge. On Thursday, January 15th, 1976, Diane Kozlowski drove past Wheatley Elementary at 4:47 in the afternoon on her way home from work and saw Carol's tan Volkswagen Beetle still in the parking lot, the lights on inside the building, the exhaust rising straight up in the cold, still air the way it did when the temperature had dropped below 20. She thought nothing of it. Carol often stayed late. The children she was tutoring that month, 2 boys who were struggling with reading and 1 girl who couldn't keep numbers in order, came in Tuesdays and Thursdays after school, and Carol never cut those sessions short. She didn't know, as she drove past, that Carol's car was already empty, that the lights she saw were the corridor lights left on by the custodian, that Carol had already been gone for more than an hour by the time Diane drove by. What had happened in that hour and who had caused it would not be known for 50 years. Diane called Carol's apartment at 7 o'clock that Thursday evening. No answer. She called again at 8:30. No answer. This was unusual enough that she noticed it, but not alarming. Carol sometimes visited a retired teacher named Mrs. Hollis, who lived nearby and didn't always hear the phone from the back of that woman's house. Diane called a 3rd time at 10 o'clock and let it ring 9 times. Then she went to bed, telling herself Carol was fine and she would see her Friday. She did not see her Friday. The substitute teacher who arrived at Wheatley Elementary at 7:45 on the morning of January 16th was a woman named Margaret Haverford, 49 years old, who had been called by the district office the previous evening when Carol had not checked in. Margaret Haverford walked into Carol's classroom and turned on the lights and set down her bag and stood for a moment in the way you do when you enter a space that belongs to someone else. The room was orderly. The lesson plan was on the desk in Carol's handwriting, already prepared for that morning. The candy jar was on the corner of the desk with about 1/3 of the root beer barrels still in it. Mrs. Haverford taught Carol's class that Friday. She taught it the following Monday too, and the Monday after that. She kept the lesson plan in Carol's handwriting on the desk in front of her the whole first week because she didn't know where else to put it. Carol's car was found in the school parking lot Friday morning by the principal, a man named Howard Belkey, who noticed it when he arrived at 7 and recognized it as Carol's and stood next to it for a long time before he went inside and called the police. The driver's door was unlocked. Carol's purse was on the passenger seat. Her keys were not in the ignition, not on the seat, not on the ground around the car. They were never found. Detective Sergeant Lou Farrell of the Harwick Falls Borough Police arrived at the school at 8:20. He was 51 years old, had been on the force for 22 years, and was the kind of detective who wrote everything down by hand in a small notebook and then transferred it to typed reports that same evening, because he believed anything you didn't write down twice, you were going to forget. He walked the parking lot in a grid. He logged everything near the driver's side door, approximately 3 feet from where Carol would have stood to open it. He found a cigarette butt. Filtered, menthol, not Carol's brand. Carol did not smoke. He picked it up with a gloved hand, put it in a paper evidence envelope, labeled it, and sealed it. He put it in the box with the rest of the case materials. In 1976, there was nothing to do with the cigarette butt except note where it was found. There was no technology that could have told him whose it was. He noted it twice in his log. He did not know, then, that it was the most important thing in the box. A search of the surrounding area began Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, it had grown to include 200 volunteers from Harwick Falls and the neighboring townships. The volunteer fire department organized the grid search of the fields and tree lines east of town. The captain of the volunteer fire department was a 29-year-old man named Gordon Haas, who had joined the department 6 years earlier and risen to captain 18 months ago, and was known around town as one of those people who showed up for everything. He organized the search teams. He assigned the grid sections. He stayed out in the cold for 12 hours on Saturday and came back Sunday and stayed for 10 more. He was also one of the people Detective Farrell interviewed in the first week of the investigation. Haas told Farrell that he had seen Carol on Wednesday evening, 2 days before she disappeared, waving at a neighbor from her porch as he drove past on his way home from a department meeting. He said she had looked fine, normal, just like always. He seemed, to Farrell, like exactly the kind of man he appeared to be, solid, clear, fully present, grieved by what had happened to a neighbor, and doing everything he could to help. Farrell had one early suspect. A custodian named Earl Briggs had been terminated by the school district the previous November after a dispute over scheduling, and had reportedly said things about Carol, who, as a teacher, had signed a complaint about the state of her classroom that had been overheard by another staff member and documented in the district's HR file. Farrell went to find Earl Briggs. Briggs had been in Scranton the night of January 15th. He had 3 people who could confirm it. He had a receipt from a diner there dated that evening. He was eliminated. There were no other solid suspects. Evelyn Weathers sat by her phone on Birch Street for 4 days after Carol disappeared, waiting for it to ring. Her son Thomas drove up from Allentown on Friday evening and did not leave for 2 weeks. He drove the county roads at night, alone, the way people do when they cannot sit still and cannot do anything useful and can't think of anything else. He drove those roads for 10 nights in a row and found nothing. Because there was nothing on those roads to find. Carol was 4 miles away, in a ravine off a logging cut, under snow that would not release her until the spring thaw. She was found on March 9, 1976, by a township road crew clearing ice damage on a forestry road. She had been there since January. The cause of death was strangulation. Nothing about the scene told investigators who had brought her there. The cigarette butt in the paper envelope was all they had, and they had no way to use it. The case file grew to 390 pages. Lou Farrell typed his final summary report in November of 1976, 10 months after Carol disappeared, and wrote at the bottom, "Investigation ongoing. No viable suspects at this time." Then he went home and sat in his kitchen and didn't talk about it for 3 days, which was not unusual for him after a case like this, and which his wife had learned over 22 years to leave alone. By 1980, Carol's case had not been officially closed, but no new investigative work was being done. The file was reviewed annually in the way all unsolved cases were reviewed, which is to say someone signed a form confirming it had been looked at and filed it again. Gordon Haas was elected chief of the Harwick Falls Volunteer Fire Department in 1981. He coached youth baseball for 15 years. He raised 3 children with his wife, Patricia, who taught piano out of their home on Cedar Street, and was known for being patient with children who had no talent and kind to their parents. Haas appeared in the local paper 7 times between 1980 and 2005, once for an award, 3 times for fire department news, twice for the baseball team. Once in a photograph from a borough council meeting where he was identified as a community advocate for road safety improvements. In 1998, the Harwick Falls Borough Council presented him with a Lifetime Community Service Award at the annual dinner. He stood at the podium in the fire hall and thanked his wife and his department and the borough, and said that service was its own reward, and people clapped, and someone took his photograph, and it ran in the paper the following week. Evelyn Weathers died in September of 2011. She was 83 years old. She had lived long enough to see Thomas's children grow up, to hold 3 grandchildren she had not expected, to sit on her porch on Birch Street through 35 summers after Carol disappeared, and watch the tomatoes grow in the pots and the neighbors' kids ride their bikes in the street. And through all of it, to carry the particular weight that a mother carries when she does not know what happened to her child. At her funeral, Thomas spoke for 11 minutes. He did not mention Carol's name once during the service. He had learned over the years that mentioning Carol to people who had not known her produced a specific look on their faces, grief-adjacent, sympathetic, slightly removed, that he could not bear. He mentioned Carol only to people who had known her. There were fewer of those people every year. The case file sat in the Harwick Falls Police Archive. The box it was stored in deteriorated steadily through 3 decades of a basement storage room that was not climate-controlled and flooded twice in the 1990s. The paper evidence envelope with the cigarette butt inside survived both floods on a shelf above the waterline, sealed since January 16, 1976, by a gloved hand that had not known how important it was, but had sealed it carefully anyway. Because Lou Farrell sealed everything carefully. It was how he had worked. Lou Farrell died in 2019 at 94 years old. He had been retired for 30 years. He had worked other cases after Carol's, other difficult ones, and he had closed most of them. But not this one. His son said afterward that he had never heard his father mention Carol Weathers more than twice. He didn't talk about the ones he didn't close, his son said. That was how he handled it. The candy jar sat on Carol's desk at Wheatley Elementary for 2 weeks in January of 1976, before Principal Belkey finally moved it. Where it went after that, no one could say. Margaret Haverford, the substitute who had taught Carol's class, kept a photograph of Carol on her desk until she retired from teaching in 1994. It was a faculty photograph from the 1975 school year. Carol in a yellow blouse, her hair down. She said she kept it because she wanted to remember whose classroom she had been filling, and because it seemed important that someone in that building remember who was supposed to be there. Margaret Haverford was 91 years old in 2026, and still alive when the news came. Before we get to that, if this story matters to you the way it matters to us, take a moment to like and subscribe. Every case on this channel comes from weeks of digging through records and sitting with lives that deserved better. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Carol. In 2024, the Pennsylvania State Police Criminal Investigation Division launched a cold case DNA audit, a systematic review of unresolved homicide cases across the state in which biological evidence had been collected but never tested due to technological limitations at the time. Detective Yolanda Marsh was 38 years old, 9 years in the cold case unit, and had been assigned to review 43 open files from the eastern Pennsylvania region. She worked from a spreadsheet. She requested evidence kits. She opened boxes. Some of the kits had been compromised, biological material degraded, chain of custody broken, samples lost entirely in a flood or a move or an administrative error. Some of the kits were intact. The Weathers kit from 1976 arrived at her desk in February of 2024, in a deteriorating cardboard box held together with rubber bands that snapped when she removed them. Inside, bagged and catalogued in the methodical handwriting of a detective who had been dead for 5 years, were the original case materials. Photographs, interview notes, a sealed paper evidence envelope marked parking lot, driver's side, 3/5. From door, cigarette butt, filtered menthol, 1/16/1976. L. Farrell. The envelope had been sealed for 48 years. She sent it to the state forensic lab in March. The lab processed the butt and extracted a partial male DNA profile in September. Partial, not complete. Not enough for a direct database match to any criminal record, but enough. The profile was uploaded to GeneMatch, a public genealogy database used by genealogical researchers and, increasingly, by law enforcement in cold case investigations. The process works by identifying distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, people who share segments of DNA with the unknown contributor, and then using traditional genealogical research to build a family tree that narrows toward a single individual. It took 6 months. In March of 2025, the lab returned a match, a woman in Youngstown, Ohio, who had submitted her DNA to an ancestry website the previous spring to learn about her family's European origins. She was a first cousin once removed of the man whose DNA was on that cigarette butt. She had no idea. She had taken the test out of curiosity, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with a little plastic kit from the internet. Yolanda Marsh got the match notification on a Tuesday. She spent 4 days building the family tree from the Ohio woman outward. She ruled out every male relative of the right age who had a documented location other than eastern Pennsylvania in January of 1976. She was left with 3 possibilities. She requested additional genealogical records. She narrowed it to 2. Then 1, Gordon Haas, born 1947. Harwick Falls, Pennsylvania. She pulled the original case file. She found his interview on page 44, interviewed January 22, 1976, 1 week after Carol's disappearance. He had been cooperative, she noted, reading Farrell's interview summary. He had been helpful. He had organized the search parties. She sat with that for a long time. In the spring of 2026, Gordon Haas was 78 years old. He had outlived his wife Patricia, who had died in 2019. He had moved in 2001 to a suburb of Allentown, 40 minutes from Harwick Falls, where he lived in a brick ranch house on a quiet street and attended the same church he had been a member of for 20 years, serving as a deacon for 12 of them. His 3 children visited regularly. He had 4 grandchildren ranging in age from 6 to 14. The 14-year-old called him Grandpa Gordy. He was, by any account anyone could give, a quiet, unassuming, faithful old man. On a Wednesday morning in March 2026, Yolanda Marsh and a Pennsylvania State Police detective named Frank Okafor drove to the brick ranch house and knocked on the door. Haas answered it himself. He was wearing a cardigan. He looked at the badges and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come in." They sat in his living room. Okafor read him his rights. Marsh placed a photograph of the Dana report on the coffee table between them. She told him what they had found. She told him how they had found it. Gordon Haas sat in his chair and looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at the window. Then he looked back at the document. "That can't be right," he said. "It is right," Marsh said. He denied it for 40 minutes. He said there must be a mistake. He said he didn't know what they were talking about. He said he had tried to help find that girl, which was true, and which everyone who had known him in 1976 would have confirmed without hesitation. Then something shifted. He stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at Marsh with an expression she would describe afterward as not quite remorse, and not quite relief, and not quite resignation. Something that combined all three in a way she didn't have a word for. He said, "I knew this day was going to come eventually." He had been waiting for 50 years. He was arrested in his living room on a Wednesday morning in March of 2026. His daughter called the police station twice that afternoon. His son, who lived 40 minutes away and had called him every Sunday for 20 years, did not call at all. The news reached Harwick Falls by that evening. The borough was smaller than it had been in 1976. About 4,800 people now, the paper mill long gone. The main street a little quieter, but the people who remained were the people who had been there. Men and women in their 60s and 70s who remembered 1976. Who remembered Carol. Who remembered Gordon Haas. One man, 66 years old, had been 17 in January of 1976 and had gone out with his father on the volunteer search on that first Saturday, the one Haas had organized. He had walked through frozen fields for 9 hours. He told a reporter from the Harwick Falls Courier that he remembered Haas handing out coffee from a thermos to the searchers in the afternoon. He had been standing right next to him. He remembered thinking what a good man he was. "He organized the search," he said. "He was out there with us looking for her." He stopped. He didn't say anything else. Gordon Haas was charged with first-degree murder by the Lehigh County District Attorney's Office in April of 2026. He entered a plea of not guilty. His public defender filed a motion challenging the validity of the genealogical DNA evidence, which was denied. His trial is scheduled for the fall of 2026. He remains in custody, having been denied bail given the severity of the charge and the 50-year flight risk determination. He is 78 years old. He is healthy enough to stand trial. Thomas Weathers was 74 years old when Yolanda Marsh called him. He was at home in Allentown, having his morning coffee when his phone rang. He did not recognize the number, but answered it, because he always answered numbers he didn't recognize. He had been answering calls he didn't recognize for 50 years, on the chance that one of them would be this. Marsh told him what she had found. She told him who they had arrested. There was a long silence. Thomas Weathers said, "Gordon Haas." He said the name the way you say something you are trying to make real by saying it aloud. "He was at the search," Thomas said. "He was there." "I know," Marsh said. Thomas was quiet again. Then he said, "My mother never knew." He said it simply, without additional words, and it was the most devastating sentence in 50 years of a case that had accumulated many devastating sentences. His mother had never known. She had died in 2011 with the question still open. She had never heard the name. She had never had the answer she had spent 35 years waiting for. Yolanda Marsh said she was sorry. She meant it. There was nothing else to say that was true. Carol Ann Weathers was 24 years old in January of 1976, and she has been 24 years old in everyone's memory ever since. Because memory cannot age a person the way time can. When the people who loved her think of her, she is 24, and she is teaching, standing at the front of a classroom, with the afternoon light coming through the windows and the candy jar on her desk, and 8-year-olds in their seats, looking at her the way children look at a teacher who makes them feel safe. Margaret Haverford, 91 years old, was sitting in the kitchen of her daughter's house in Scranton on the morning the news came. Her daughter had seen it on her phone and gone to find her mother and brought the phone to show her. Margaret Haverford looked at the photograph of Gordon Haas that ran with the article, and then she looked at the window, and then she looked at her daughter and said, "Carol knew him." Her daughter said, "I know, Mom." Margaret Haverford did not say anything else for a long time. Then she said she was glad she had lived to see it. She said she hadn't been sure she would. Thomas Weathers drove to his mother's grave in Harwick Falls the week after the arrest. He brought flowers, the kind of wild arrangement that Evelyn had always preferred to anything florist made. He stood at the headstone for a while. He did not speak. He did not know what to say to her that she hadn't earned the right to hear 50 years ago, when she was alive and waiting. He put the flowers down. He stood there until he was ready to leave. The bicentennial summer of 1976 arrived in Harwick Falls without Carol. The 4th of July celebration was the biggest the town had ever done. Fireworks over the reservoir, a parade down Main Street, bunting on every storefront. Carol had been dead for 4 months by then. She never saw July. She never saw the fireworks. The year that was supposed to be a celebration passed over her without her, the way all the years since had. What the science ultimately found, what a paper envelope sealed by a careful man's hand in 1976, preserved all the way to a Tuesday in a lab in 2024, was not just a DNA profile. It was a thread that had been waiting in the dark for a technology patient enough to follow it. It took 50 years for that technology to arrive. It took an audit, and a detective, and a woman in Ohio who was curious about her ancestors, and 6 months of genealogy work on a spreadsheet. It took all of those things in a sequence that could have failed at any single point, and didn't. Lou Farrell had sealed that envelope carefully. He had labeled it twice. He had put it in the box with everything else and written ongoing at the bottom of his report and typed it the same evening so he wouldn't forget. He had done his job. The rest took 50 years. Gordon Haas coached youth baseball for 15 years, served as a church deacon for 12, and was standing in that field with the other searchers on a January Saturday in 1976, handing out coffee from a thermos. What does it say about trust, and about the limits of what a community can know about the people inside it, that he was able to live in plain sight for half a century? Is 50 years in prison, for a man in his late 70s, justice? Or is justice something the justice system can't actually deliver when this much time has passed? And what do we owe to the people who are gone, the Evelyn Weatherses of these cases, the parents who died without answers, when the answer finally comes? Leave your thoughts below. 50 years. A paper envelope. A careful detective's handwriting. And the name that everyone trusted, finally spoken aloud. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are in the description below. Thank you for being here.